The massive colonial mansion sat like a monument to old money. Its perfectly manicured gardens and gleaming Mercedes lineup in the circular drive telling a story of wealth that had never known struggle. Maria adjusted her simple black blazer and smoothed her hair, trying to look presentable for her sister's engagement party. What the Hampton family didn't know was that the woman they were about to dismiss as just Elena's sister had spent the last 8 years leading special operations teams through the most dangerous missions in 3 different countries. Little did they know they were about to underestimate the wrong veteran. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Maria Rodriguez sat in her weathered Toyota Camry outside the Hampton estate, staring up at the imposing structure that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread rather than real life. She'd driven 4 hours straight from Fort Braxton, barely taking time to change out of her ACUs into civilian clothes. The simple black blazer, white button-down, and dark jeans were the nicest civilian outfit she owned, a far cry from the designer dresses and pearls she could see through the mansion's tall windows. After 18 months in Afghanistan and another year in Iraq, even this peaceful Westchester neighborhood felt surreal. The manicured lawns, the ornate streetlights, the complete absence of any threat beyond social embarrassment. It was a world so removed from the forward operating bases and hostile territories where she'd spent the better part of the last 8 years, that it might as well have been another planet. She checked her phone one last time. Elena had been texting all day, "Can't wait for you to meet Derek's family. They're so excited to finally meet my little sister," followed by, "You're going to love them, they're amazing." And most recently, "Where are you?" The party started an hour ago. Maria smiled despite her exhaustion. Elena had always been the social butterfly, the one who could walk into any room and instantly become the center of attention. At 28, she was 2 years younger than Maria but had always seemed to navigate the civilian world with an ease that Maria envied. While Maria was learning combat tactics and weapons maintenance, Elena had been perfecting the art of small talk and social grace. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted from inside the house. Through the large bay windows, Maria could see about 40 people mingling in what looked like a scene from a luxury lifestyle magazine. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over women in cocktail dresses that probably cost more than Maria's monthly car payment, and men in suits that had clearly never seen the inside of a department store. Everyone held wine glasses and spoke in the refined tones of people who'd never worried about whether they could afford their next meal. Maria took a deep breath, the same way she used to before leading her unit into potentially hostile territory. She'd coordinated airstrikes in Kandahar, managed supply lines through insurgent-controlled regions, and led rescue operations that had saved dozens of lives. But somehow, the thought of making small talk with Derek Hampton's wealthy family felt more intimidating than any combat zone she'd ever entered. The difference was simple. In combat, she knew the rules. She understood the hierarchy, the protocols, the objective. Here, in this world of old money and social connections, she was operating without a manual. Her 8 years of military service, her 2 Bronze Stars, her commendations for valor, none of that would matter to people who measured worth by trust funds and country club membership. Elena had tried to prepare her, of course. "Derek's family is wonderful," she'd said during their last phone call. "His father owns 3 hotels and his mother sits on the boards of like 5 different charities. They're very involved in the community." What Elena hadn't said, but Maria understood perfectly, was that the Hampton family existed in a stratosphere of wealth and privilege that neither Rodriguez's sister had ever experienced. Their own father had been a mechanic, their mother a school teacher. They'd grown up in a modest 2-bedroom house in Queens, where dinner conversations revolved around bills and homework, not yacht club events and charity galas. Elena had escaped that world through her marketing career and natural social skill. Maria had found her purpose in the military, where performance mattered more than pedigree. The engagement party was supposed to be a small gathering, according to Derek. But looking at the crowd through the windows, Maria realized that small meant something very different to the Hampton family than it did to someone who'd spent years in mess tents where 20 people constituted a crowd. The jewelry visible on the women alone probably represented more wealth than most soldiers would see in a lifetime. Maria straightened her shoulders and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, a habit from years of military regulations, and her makeup was minimal. She looked professional, respectable, but utterly ordinary by Hampton standard. In her world, extraordinary meant leading troops through danger and bringing them home safely. In their world, extraordinary meant wearing the right designer labels and knowing which fork to use for the salad course. She grabbed the small gift bag from the passenger seat, a crystal picture frame she'd found at Target, the best she could afford on a captain's salary, and stepped out of her car. The evening air carried the scent of expensive perfume and catered food, so different from the diesel fumes and dust she'd grown accustomed to overseas. As she walked up the cobblestone driveway, Maria noticed the details that her military training had taught her to observe: the security cameras discreetly positioned around the property, the motion sensor lights, the expensive alarm system visible through the window. Old habits died hard, even at an engagement party. She pressed the doorbell, hearing elegant chimes echo through what sounded like a very large foyer. Footsteps approached, expensive heels clicking on marble floor. Maria put on her best smile and prepared to enter a world where her greatest accomplishments would be invisible, where her leadership in life or death situations would mean nothing compared to the right last name or social connection. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than Maria's rent. Patricia Hampton looked Maria up and down with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to cataloging people's social status within seconds. "You must be Elena's sister," Patricia said, her smile polite but distinctly cool. "I'm Patricia Hampton, Derek's mother. Please, do come in." As Maria stepped into the marble-floored foyer, she could feel Patricia's gaze taking inventory: the off-the-rack blazer, the department store shoes, the complete absence of any visible jewelry or designer accessory. In Patricia's world, these details painted a complete picture of a person's worth and place in the social hierarchy. "Elena will be absolutely thrilled you made it," Patricia continued, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people used when they were being gracious to those they considered beneath their station. "She's been telling everyone about her sister, though she was rather vague about what you do for work. Something with the government, I believe." Before Maria could answer, Elena's voice rang out from the living room. "Maria, oh my God, you're here." Her sister appeared in the doorway like a vision in emerald green silk, her face lighting up with genuine joy as she rushed over for a hug. "I can't believe you actually made it," Elena squealed, throwing her arms around Maria with the enthusiasm of someone who'd had just enough champagne to lower her usual social guard. The emerald silk dress she wore probably cost more than Maria's entire wardrobe, but her smile was pure Elena, the same radiant grin she'd worn since childhood whenever Maria came home on leave. "Wouldn't miss my baby sister's engagement party," Maria replied, returning the hug with genuine warmth. For a moment, surrounded by Elena's familiar embrace, the intimidating mansion and judgmental stares faded into background noise. This was why she'd driven 4 hours after a grueling week of training exercises. Not for the Hampton family's approval, but for Elena. Patricia cleared her throat delicately, a sound that somehow managed to convey both impatience and disdain. "Elena, darling, you really should introduce your sister to our guests. Everyone's been simply dying to meet her." The way Patricia emphasized "our guests" made it clear that Maria wasn't considered part of that exclusive category. Elena, either oblivious to the subtle slight or choosing to ignore it, beamed as she linked arms with Maria. "Of course, come on, I want you to meet Derek and his family. You're going to love them." As they walked into the living room, Maria's military training automatically cataloged the scene. Approximately 40 guests, mostly middle-aged to elderly, clustered in small groups throughout the expansive space. The men wore suits that screamed bespoke tailoring, while the women displayed enough jewelry to fund a small military operation. Everyone held crystal glasses filled with what appeared to be very expensive wine, and the conversations she could overhear revolved around vacation homes in the Hamptons, yacht club politics, and charity fundraisers. "Derek," Elena called out to a tall, blonde man in his early 30s, who was holding court near an imposing stone fireplace. "Come meet my sister, Derek. Hampton III had the kind of effortless confidence that came from never having to worry about money or approval. His navy blazer was perfectly tailored, his watch was clearly a Rolex, and his smile was practiced in the way of someone who'd been networking since childhood. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He approached with the casual grace of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. "So you're the famous sister we've heard so much about," Derek said, extending a manicured hand. His grip was firm but brief, and Maria noticed how his eyes quickly assessed her appearance with the same calculating look his mother had given her. "Elena's told us you work for the government, State Department, Treasury, something like that," Maria replied diplomatically. Elena had obviously been vague about her military service, probably trying to avoid the awkward conversations that often arose when people learned about her combat deployment. Most civilians either treated veterans like broken victims who needed pity, or as potential threats who might snap at any moment. Very few understood the reality of professional military service. "How wonderfully mysterious," Patricia interjected, appearing at Derek's side with the silent efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "Government work can be so varied. Are you in Washington, New York?" "I'm currently stationed at Fort Braxton in North Carolina," Maria answered honestly, watching as several nearby conversations quieted. The word "stationed" had clearly registered with the crowd. "Oh," Patricia's smile became even more strained. "Military? How civic-minded of you." The way she said "military" made it sound like Maria had admitted to being a tax collector or parking meter attendant. Around them, Maria could feel the subtle shift in the room's energy as word spread that Elena's sister was just a soldier. In their world, military service was something other people's children did, the kids who couldn't get into good colleges or afford better options. "What branch?" asked a heavyset man with graying temples who'd introduced himself as Richard Vandermeer, Derek's godfather. "My nephew did a stint in the Coast Guard after college. Character building, we thought." "Army," Maria replied simply. "Ah, enlisted then," Richard nodded knowingly. "Well, it's honest work, better than some of the alternatives these days." Maria felt Elena stiffen beside her, finally picking up on the condescending undertones that had been present since her arrival. Her sister might be socially adept, but she wasn't naive. The assumption that Maria was enlisted rather than an officer, the dismissive honest work comment, the general air of superiority, it was all landing exactly as intended. "Actually, Maria's a captain," Elena said, her voice carrying a slight edge. "She's been deployed overseas multiple times." "Captain," Patricia repeated, as if testing the word's weight. "How long does it take to reach that rank? Is it like corporate promotions?" The question revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of military hierarchy that Maria almost smiled. These people understood trust funds and board positions, but the concept of earning rank through performance and sacrifice was completely foreign to them. "It depends on your specialty and performance," Maria answered diplomatically. "I've been in for 8 years." 8 years, Derek's father, Hampton Sr., had joined the conversation, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "That's quite a commitment. What's your exit strategy? Are you planning to leverage that experience into something permanent?" The implication was clear. Military service was a phase, something to be outgrown and moved past. The idea that Maria might view her career as meaningful and important, rather than a stepping stone to something better, clearly hadn't occurred to any of them. "I haven't decided yet," Maria replied, which was true. She'd been considering whether to stay in for a full 20-year career or transition to civilian life, but that decision was based on her own goals and values, not on what the Hampton family considered appropriate career progression. "Well, there's always time to reassess," Patricia said with the tone of someone offering sage advice to a confused child. "Elena mentioned you're quite bright. I'm sure with the right guidance you could find something more suitable." Around them, other guests had begun to take notice of the conversation. Maria could feel their eyes on her, cataloging her simple clothes and obvious outsider status. She caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Elena's sister, military, 8 years enlisted." The inaccuracies didn't matter. The judgment was already forming. Elena's grip on her arm tightened, and Maria could see her sister struggling between loyalty and embarrassment. This wasn't the warm family introduction Elena had envisioned, and the strain was beginning to show on her usually perfect social facade. "Maybe we should get you something to drink," Elena suggested, clearly looking for an escape route from the increasingly uncomfortable conversation. "Excellent idea," Patricia agreed quickly, apparently equally eager to move Elena away from her problematic sister. "There's champagne, or perhaps something more accessible." As Elena guided Maria toward the elaborate bar set up in the corner of the room, Maria's military training kicked into high gear. 8 years of service had taught her to read rooms and assess threats, and right now, every instinct was telling her she was walking into hostile territory. The difference was that instead of scanning for IEDs or sniper positions, she was cataloging social landmines and potential verbal ambushes. The bar area was staffed by 2 professional bartenders in crisp white shirts, serving drinks that probably cost more per glass than most soldiers made in a day. Behind them, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the Hampton estate's perfectly manicured grounds, where strategically placed lighting illuminated gardens that looked like they belonged in a luxury resort brochure. "I'm so sorry about that," Elena whispered as they walked, her voice tight with embarrassment. They're usually not so direct with their questions. Maria noticed how Elena said direct instead of rude or condescending, still trying to protect the family she was about to marry into. It was a loyalty that Maria understood. She'd felt the same way about her military unit, even when individual members made mistakes or showed poor judgment. "It's fine, sis," Maria replied quietly. "I've dealt with worse." And she hostile interrogations from captured insurgents, dismissive attitudes from coalition partners who questioned American tactics, condescending lectures from politicians who'd never spent a day in the field. The Hampton family's social snobbery was annoying, but it wasn't exactly life-threatening. As they approached the bar, Maria automatically positioned herself where she could see both the entrance to the room and the hallway leading to other parts of the house. Old habits from convoy security and base protection protocols: always know your exits, always maintain situational awareness. The skill that had kept her alive in Afghanistan was now helping her navigate a cocktail party in Westchester. "What can I get for you ladies?" asked the bartender, a young man with a professional smile who clearly recognized Elena as the guest of honor. "Champagne for me," Elena said, then looked at Maria questioningly. "Just water, please," Maria replied, earning a surprised look from both Elena and the bartender. In truth, she rarely drank alcohol anymore, a habit formed during deployments where maintaining alertness could mean the difference between life and death for her entire unit. "Water?" Elena asked. "Come on, Mar, live a little. It's my engagement part." "I'm driving," Maria explained, which was true but not the whole truth. She'd learned to stay sharp in unfamiliar environments, and something about the Hampton family's attitude suggested she might need all her wits about her before the evening was over. The bartender handed over Elena's champagne and Maria's sparkling water, both served in crystal glasses that probably cost more than Maria's monthly utility bill. As they turned to rejoin the party, Maria noticed how the conversations around them seemed to pause whenever they moved through the room. She was becoming the evening's entertainment, the curiosity that everyone wanted to examine and discuss. Elena, darling, a woman with silver hair and enough diamonds to fund a small country, approached them with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "You simply must introduce me to your sister. I'm Margaret Whitmore from the Yacht Club board." Maria recognized the type immediately, the information gatherer, the social intelligence officer of the upper-class world. Margaret would extract every detail about Maria's background, then distribute that intelligence throughout their social network faster than any military communications system. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is my sister, Maria," Elena said, her voice regaining some of its earlier enthusiasm. "Maria, Miss Whitmore sits on the board of basically every important charity in the county." "How fascinating," Margaret said, giving Maria the same appraising look she might use to evaluate a piece of questionable artwork. "Elena tells me you're in the military. How unique. Tell me, what exactly do you do? Are you one of those women who flies helicopters, or perhaps something with computers?" The questions revealed Margaret's complete ignorance about military structure and specialties, but they were asked with the confident assumption that whatever Maria did, it couldn't be too important or complex. In Margaret's world, military service was either piloting, which was exotic enough to be interesting, or technical work which was safe and unthreatening. "I'm an infantry officer," Maria replied, watching Margaret's face process this information. The concept of a woman leading combat troops was clearly outside her frame of reference. "Infantry," Margaret repeated slowly. "That's soldiers, fighting, leading soldiers," Maria corrected gently. "Planning operations, training units, managing logistics." She could have mentioned the night raids in Kandahar, the convoy operations through hostile territory, the times she'd called in artillery strikes while under enemy fire. She could have described coordinating with special operations forces, or the medal recommendations she'd written for soldiers who'd shown extraordinary courage under fire, but something told her that level of detail would only make these people more uncomfortable. "How very hands-on," Margaret said, clearly struggling to categorize this information. "And you've been overseas?" "Multiple deployments," Maria confirmed. Margaret's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy, or possibly pity. "How difficult that must have been, all that violence and unpleasantness. Have you considered counseling? I know several excellent therapists who specialize in helping people readjust to normal life." The assumption was breathtaking in its ignorance, that Maria was a damaged victim who needed fixing, rather than a trained professional who'd successfully completed some of the military's most challenging assignments. Margaret had never considered that Maria might be proud of her service, or that she might have chosen it because she was good at it. "I appreciate the concern," Maria replied diplomatically, "but I'm doing fine." Elena stepped closer, clearly sensing the condescension in Margaret's tone. "Maria's amazing at what she does. She's led troops in some really dangerous situations, and brought everyone home safely." "Oh my," Margaret said, her hand fluttering to her throat in a gesture of delicate distress. "How terrifying. You poor dear, having to deal with all that chaos." "No wonder you seem so serious." Around them, more guests had begun to drift over, drawn by the unusual conversation topic. Maria could feel herself becoming the center of attention in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable. In the military, she was respected for her competence and leadership. Here, she was an exotic specimen to be examined and pitied. "Mrs. Rodriguez," a man's voice cut through the growing crowd. "Might I have a word?" Maria turned to see a distinguished gentleman in his 70s approaching, with a purposeful stride that immediately caught her attention. Unlike the other guests, he moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and his eyes held the sharp awareness she recognized in experienced military personnel. "Of course," Maria replied, though she noticed he'd correctly assumed her rank without being told, another sign that this man was different from the rest of the Hampton family's social circle. The distinguished gentleman extended his hand with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to military protocol. "Colonel Harrison Blackwood, retired," he said, his grip firm and respectful. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with Mrs. Whitmore." "Infantry officer, you said?" "Yes, sir," Maria replied automatically, her posture straightening slightly in the presence of a senior officer, even a retired one. There was something immediately reassuring about Colonel Blackwood's presence. The first person all evening who'd treated her with genuine respect. "Excellent," he said with approval. "We need more officers like you." "Which theater?" "Afghanistan and Iraq, sir. 2 deployments each." Colonel Blackwood nodded knowingly. "Tough assignments. I did 3 tours in Vietnam myself, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth." His eyes held the recognition of shared experience that only came from understanding the weight of command in hostile territory. Behind them, Maria could hear Margaret Whitmore's voice rising with indignation. "Well, I never," she was saying to Patricia Hampton. "The girl seems positively hardened. All that military talk. It's quite unseemly for a young woman, don't you think?" "Absolutely," Patricia agreed, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "I can't imagine what Elena was thinking, bringing her here tonight. The poor dear clearly doesn't understand social expectations. Did you see those clothes? That hair? She looks like she just rolled out of a..." A barracks or something. Elena's face flushed red with embarrassment or something. Elena's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. Mrs. Hampton, that's my sister you're talking about, she said, her voice shakier than Maria had ever heard it. Oh, darling, Patricia said with the kind of false sympathy that made Maria's jaw clench. I'm not criticizing. I'm sure she's doing the best she can with her limited background. But you have to understand, when you marry Derek, you'll be part of a certain social circle. There are expectations, standards to maintain. Derek, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke up, but not in the way Elena clearly hoped. Mother's right, Elena. I mean, I'm sure Maria's a fine person, but she's not exactly our crowd. The military thing is very patriotic and all, but it's not really the image we want to project at family gatherings. Maria felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, a reaction she quickly controlled. Colonel Blackwood noticed the movement and gave her a subtle look that said, "Steady, Captain," as clearly as if he'd spoken the words aloud. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the increasingly uncomfortable conversation like spectators at a car accident. Maria could see the faces of the Hampton family's friends and associates, all wearing expressions of barely concealed amusement at the drama unfolding before them. "You know what I heard?" said a man Maria hadn't been introduced to, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "I heard the military is just a welfare program now. They take people who can't make it in the real world and give them free housing and health care. It's basically socialism with uniforms." Several people laughed at this observation, apparently finding it tremendously clever. Maria noticed Elena's hands trembling as she held her champagne glass, her face pale with shock at how quickly the evening had turned cruel. "That's absurd," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria earned her position. "She's a captain. She's led soldiers in combat." "Combat," scoffed Richard Vandermeer. "Derek's godfather. You mean like video games? Most of that stuff is done with drones now, isn't it? Push a button, boom, mission accomplished. Not exactly what I'd call real leadership." The ignorance was staggering, but Maria had encountered it before. Civilians who thought modern warfare was conducted like a video game, with no understanding of the split-second decisions, the responsibility for human lives, the psychological toll of leading troops in life-or-death situations. "I think," said Margaret Whitmore, clearly enjoying her role as social prosecutor, "the real question is whether someone with that kind of background is really suited for polite society. All that violence and aggression, it changes people, doesn't it? Makes them unsuitable for civilized company." "Exactly," Patricia Hampton agreed, warming to the theme. "And frankly, Elena, if you're going to be part of this family, you need to understand that we have a reputation to maintain. The Hamptons have been leaders in this community for generations. We can't have people associating us with the kind of rough elements that the military attracts." Maria felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't just snobbery anymore. This was a calculated attack designed to humiliate her and force Elena to choose between her family and her sister. She could see the tears forming in Elena's eyes, could see her sister's world crumbling as she realized exactly what kind of people she was planning to marry into. "The military attracts rough elements." Colonel Blackwood's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. "How interesting. I wasn't aware that defending one's country was considered rough behavior in civilized society." Several guests looked uncomfortable at the retired colonel's intervention, but Patricia Hampton was too committed to her position to back down. "Well, of course we appreciate military service in the abstract," she said dismissively. "But let's be honest. It's not exactly the same social level as the rest of us here tonight, is it?" "Social level," Maria repeated quietly, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that Colonel Blackwood recognized immediately. 8 years of military training had taught her to control her temper, but there were limits to what anyone should be expected to endure. "Now, Maria," Elena said desperately, reaching for her sister's arm. "Please don't." "Don't what?" Derek interrupted, his confidence apparently bolstered by his family's support. "Don't cause a scene. Don't embarrass us further." "Elena, I think it's pretty clear that your sister doesn't belong here. Maybe she should just go." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before combat, the heightened awareness that had kept her alive in hostile territory. But this time, the hostility was coming from her sister's future family, and the battlefield was a cocktail party in Westchester. "Derek," Elena whispered, her voice breaking. "How can you say that?" "I'm saying it because it's true," Derek replied, his mask of polite civility finally slipping completely. "Look at her, Elena. Look at this whole situation. She's making everyone uncomfortable. She doesn't fit in, and she never will. The sooner you accept that, the better off we'll all be." Around them, the other guests watched with the fascination of people witnessing a social execution. Some looked uncomfortable, but none spoke up in Maria's defense. They were all part of the same insular world, bound by the same unspoken rules about who belonged and who didn't. Maria looked at her sister's tear-streaked face, then at the circle of hostile, condescending faces surrounding them. For 8 years she'd protected American interests overseas, often working with allies who initially doubted her capabilities because of her age or gender. She'd proven herself time and again through competence, courage, and results. But here, in this marble-floored mansion, filled with people who'd never risked anything more dangerous than a bad stock investment, none of that mattered. Here she was just the wrong kind of person, wearing the wrong kind of clothes from the wrong kind of background. Colonel Blackwood stepped closer to Maria, his presence solid and reassuring. "Captain Rodriguez," he said quietly, "would you mind if I made a phone call? There's someone I think should know about this conversation." Before Maria could respond to Colonel Blackwood's cryptic offer, Derek Hampton III decided to escalate the situation further. His face had flushed red with wine and righteous indignation, and he clearly felt emboldened by the support of his family and friends. "You know what?" Derek announced loudly, addressing the room as much as Maria. "I think we need to be completely honest here. Elena, you're about to become a Hampton. That means something in this community. It means standards, traditions, expectations." He gestured broadly at Maria with his wine glass, drops of expensive Bordeaux splashing onto the marble floor. "This is exactly the kind of situation we need to avoid. Bringing military people into social gatherings where they simply don't belong. They don't understand our world, our values, our way of life." Hampton, Sr., Derek's father, nodded approvingly from his position near the fireplace. "Derek's absolutely right. The Hampton name has been associated with excellence and refinement for 4 generations. We've built our reputation on careful associations and appropriate social connections." Maria felt Elena's hand slip into hers, her sister's fingers cold and trembling. But instead of offering comfort, Elena's touch felt more like an apology, or maybe a goodbye. "I'm sorry, Maria," Elena whispered, so quietly, only Maria could hear. "I had no idea they were like this. I thought they were different." Margaret Whitmore, apparently deciding that the situation called for additional cruelty, stepped forward with the smile of someone about to deliver a killing blow. "You know, dear," she said to Maria with false sweetness, "I think what everyone is trying to say is that you'd probably be more comfortable at a VFW hall or one of those military bars, somewhere with your own kind of people." The phrase "your own kind" hit Maria like a physical slap. She'd heard variations of it throughout her military career, usually from foreign nationals, who couldn't believe that a young Latina woman could be leading American troops. She'd proven those doubters wrong through competence and results, earning respect one mission at a time. But here, in this mansion filled with inherited wealth and unearned privilege, proof didn't seem to matter. Here, she was being judged, not by her accomplishments, but by her bank account, not by her character but by her clothes, not by her service to her country, but by her failure to fit into their narrow definition of acceptable society. "Your own kind," Maria repeated slowly, her voice dangerously quiet. Around her, the crowd seemed to sense that something had shifted, though they couldn't quite identify what. "Well, yes," Margaret continued, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. "Surely you understand that different people belong in different social circles. It's nothing personal. It's just the natural order of things." Richard Vandermeer joined the attack with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a safe target. "The military is fine for people who need structure and can't think for themselves. But leadership, real leadership. That requires breeding, education, refinement, things you can't learn in boot camp. Maria's combat training had taught her to recognize the moment when a situation moved from manageable to dangerous. Right now, she was approaching that line, not because of physical threat, but because of the raw injustice of watching her sister's face crumble as she realized what kind of family she was marrying into. Patricia Hampton, sensing victory, decided to deliver what she clearly thought would be the final blow. Elena, darling, I think your sister needs to understand something very important. When you marry Derek, you'll be moving in circles where background matters, where heritage counts, where people are judged by their contributions to society, real contributions, not playing soldier in foreign country. Playing soldier, Maria said, her voice carrying a deadly calm that Colonel Blackwood recognized immediately. The retired officer placed a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder, a gesture that somehow managed to be both restraining and supportive. That's right, Patricia continued, warming to her theme. All this talk about combat and leadership and bringing soldiers home safely, it's very dramatic, I'm sure, but it's not real life. Real life is building businesses, supporting communities, creating lasting value, not running around with guns, pretending to be important. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the background conversations had stopped as people turned to watch what was clearly becoming the evening's main entertainment. Maria could feel 40 pairs of eyes on her, some curious, some amused, some uncomfortable, but none sympathetic. Elena's grip on her hand tightened. "Please," she whispered, "please don't make this worse." But Maria wasn't thinking about making things worse. She was thinking about the 23 soldiers she'd led through 2 combat deployments, 19 of whom had made it home alive and whole. She was thinking about the villages they'd protected, the supply convoys they'd secured, the intelligence operations that had saved countless civilian lives. She was thinking about her Bronze Star citation, which read, "For exceptionally valorous conduct in action against the enemy, while serving as a company commander during combat operations in Afghanistan." Captain Rodriguez's exceptional leadership under fire and tactical brilliance saved the lives of multiple coalition forces and civilian contractors during a complex enemy attack. Most of all, she was thinking about the folded American flag in her apartment, the one that had covered the coffin of Sergeant Martinez, a 19-year-old kid from Texas, who died saving a school full of Afghan children from a suicide bomber. "Playing soldier," she repeated again, and this time her voice carried something that made several guests take an involuntary step backward. Derek, either misreading the situation completely, or too arrogant to care, decided to press his advantage. "Look, I'm sure you've had some interesting experiences, but let's be realistic here. You're what, 30, still living off a government paycheck, probably in some little apartment on base somewhere, no savings, no property, no real career prospects." He gestured around the opulent room. "This is what success looks like. This is what Elena deserves. Someone who can provide for her, protect her, give her a real future. Not someone who's gonna spend the next 20 years taking orders and moving from base to base." Maria felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. These people weren't just dismissing her service. They were dismissing everything she'd worked for, everything she'd sacrificed, everything she believed in. They were reducing 8 years of leadership, courage and sacrifice to a career choice they found unsuitable for polite society. Colonel Blackwood's hand remained on her shoulder, steady and grounding. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd commanded respect in situations far more dangerous than a cocktail party. "Mr. Hampton," he said quietly, "I think you should stop talking now." Derek turned to face the colonel with the condescending smile of someone who'd never been challenged by anyone he couldn't buy or intimidate. "And I think you should mind your own business, old man. This is a private family matter." Colonel Blackwood smiled then, not a pleasant expression, but the kind of smile that had once preceded very bad news for enemy commanders. "Actually," he said, reaching for his phone, "I think it just became a very public matter." Derek's face twisted with indignation at the old colonel's implied threat. The wine and his family's support had made him bold, and he clearly wasn't about to be intimidated by what he saw as an elderly man with outdated ideas about respect and hierarchy. "Public matter." Derek laughed. a harsh sound that carried across the suddenly quiet room. What are you going to do? Call your buddies at the old folks' home, post something on Facebook about the mean rich people. His friends and family members chuckled appreciatively at what they apparently considered a devastating comeback. Hampton Sr. raised his wine glass in a mock toast to his son's wit, while Patricia beamed with maternal pride at Derek's handling of the situation. You military types are all the same, Derek continued, emboldened by the laughter. You think your little titles and ribbons mean something in the real world, but newsflash, Grandpa, nobody cares about your war stories. This isn't 1943 and you're not storming any beach. Margaret Whitmore clapped her hands together in delight. Oh, Derek, you're terrible, but honestly, they do tend to live in the past, don't they? Always talking about their glory days and expecting special treatment. Maria felt her jaw clench as she watched these people mock a decorated veteran who'd served his country with distinction. Colonel Blackwood had shown her nothing but respect and courtesy, while these privileged socialites had spent the evening demonstrating exactly how little they understood about honor, service, or basic human decency. Colonel Blackwood served 3 tours in Vietnam, Maria said quietly, her voice cutting through their laughter like a blade. He earned his rank and his respect through blood and sacrifice, while people like you were safely at home, counting your trust fund dividend. Oh, here we go, Richard Vandermeer groaned dramatically. The military worship begins. Next, she'll be telling us we owe them our freedom and should be grateful for their service. Actually, Patricia Hampton added with venomous sweetness, I think we've been more than patient enough with this little patriotic display. Elena, darling, I think it's time your sister understood that her behavior is completely inappropriate for a gathering like this. Elena's face had gone pale, and Maria could see tears threatening to spill down her sister's cheek. The woman she'd driven 4 hours to support was being forced to watch her future family systematically destroy everything Maria represented, and there was nothing Elena could do about it without jeopardizing her own future. Inappropriate, Maria repeated, tasting the word like poison. What exactly have I done that's inappropriate? Existed, served my country, failed to wear the right designer labels. You've made everyone uncomfortable, Derek said, his voice rising with self-righteous anger. You've turned what should have been a celebration into some kind of political statement about military service and sacrifice. Nobody asked for a lecture about your war experiences. I haven't mentioned my war experiences, Maria pointed out with dangerous calm. I haven't talked about the soldiers I've led, the operations I've planned, the people I've saved or the friends I've lost. All I've done is stand here while you and your family have spent the evening explaining why someone like me doesn't belong in your world. Colonel Blackwood, who had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, finally reached his breaking point. Miss Hampton, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded thousands of soldiers in combat. You have exactly 30 seconds to apologize to Captain Rodriguez before I make that phone call. Derek's response was to let out a bark of incredulous laughter. Apologize? To her? For what? For pointing out that she doesn't fit in here? For being honest about the fact that military service isn't exactly a qualification for high society? You want to know what military service? Colonel Blackwood asked, his voice dropping to a register that made several guests step backward. Captain Rodriguez here has led more soldiers through more dangerous situations than you could handle in your worst nightmare. She's made decisions under fire that saved lives, planned operations that protected civilians, and earned decorations for valor that you couldn't pronounce, let alone understand. Decorations, Hampton Sr. scoffed from his position by the fireplace. Pieces of ribbon and metal. I have golf trophies that required more skill to earn. The comparison of military decorations to golf trophies sent a ripple of shocked silence through the room. Even some of the Hampton family's supporters looked uncomfortable at the elder Hampton's casual dismissal of military honor. Maria felt something snap inside her chest, not anger exactly, but a cold, crystalline clarity that came from finally understanding exactly what kind of people she was dealing with. These weren't just snobs or social climbers. These were people who fundamentally believed that wealth and privilege made them superior to anyone who actually worked for a living, anyone who served others, anyone who put their life on the line for principles larger than their own comfort. Golf trophies, she said, her voice so quiet that people had to strain to hear her. You're comparing military decorations to golf trophies, why not? Patricia chimed in, apparently feeling that the conversation needed her particular brand of venom. At least golf requires actual skill and training. Any idiot can follow orders and march around in formation. Elena made a small broken sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. Her sister's service, her sacrifice, her courage, all of it was being reduced to marching around in formation by people who'd never risked anything more dangerous than a bad investment. Colonel Blackwood looked at his phone, then back at Derek with an expression that would have made seasoned combat veterans nervous. "Time's up," he said simply, and began dialing. "Go ahead and call whoever you want," Derek said with drunken bravado. "Call the president, call the Pentagon, call God himself. It won't change the fact that your little soldier girl here doesn't belong in civilized society." Around them, the crowd had grown larger as more guests abandoned their own conversations to watch the spectacle. Maria could see phones appearing as people began recording what they clearly expected to be a memorable social media moment, the night the military girl got put in her place by the Hampton family. Colonel Blackwood finished dialing and held the phone to his ear. When the call connected, his voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent room. "General Morrison, it's Harrison Blackwood. I'm sorry to bother you on a Saturday evening, but I'm at a social gathering in Westchester, and I think there's someone here you need to speak with." The mention of a general's name should have given Derek pause, but the combination of expensive wine and wounded pride had pushed him far beyond the point of rational thinking. Instead of backing down, he stepped closer to Colonel Blackwood with the aggressive swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Oh, please," Derek sneered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You think you can intimidate us with your military connections? This is private property, old man. My family's property, and I want both of you out now." The crowd around them seemed to collectively hold its breath. Even Patricia Hampton looked slightly uncomfortable with her son's escalating aggression toward a decorated veteran, though she made no move to intervene. "Derek," Elena whispered desperately, tugging at her fiancé's sleeve. "Please, just stop. You're making this work." But Derek shook her off with an irritated gesture, his attention focused entirely on what he perceived as a challenge to his authority in his own home. "No, Elena, I'm done being polite about this. These people need to understand their place." Maria watched the scene unfold with the detached awareness that came from years of assessing rapidly deteriorating situations. Derek's body language screamed aggression, clenched fists, forward-leaning posture, invasion of personal space. In a combat zone, these would be clear indicators of imminent threat escalation. Colonel Blackwood, still holding his phone, spoke into it with the calm professionalism of someone delivering a tactical report. "Yes, General. I have Captain Maria Rodriguez here. She's an infantry officer, neck years of service, multiple combat deployments. Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't care if she's General Patton himself," Derek snarled, reaching out to grab the phone from Colonel Blackwood's hand. "This conversation is over." The colonel's response was swift and decisive. Years of military training had taught him to handle aggressive individuals, and Derek Hampton III was far from the most dangerous person he'd ever faced. With a movement so quick and economical that most of the crowd missed it, he secured his phone while simultaneously stepping back and positioning himself between Derek and Maria. "Son," Colonel Blackwood said quietly, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd commanded respect in life-or-death situations, "I strongly advise you to step back and reconsider your actions." But Derek was beyond listening to advice. The evening's humiliations, being corrected about Maria's rank, having his family's prejudices called out, being challenged by people he considered beneath him, had culminated in a rage that demanded satisfaction. "Don't son me, you senile old fool," Derek spat, his face red with wine and fury. "You come into my house, you disrespect my family, you threaten us with your little phone calls to imaginary generals. Well, here's a reality check. Your military authority means nothing here." Margaret Whitmore, apparently deciding that the situation called for additional fuel on the fire, stepped forward with malicious glee. "He's absolutely right, Derek. These military people think they can boss everyone around just because they wore a uniform. Someone needs to put them in their place. Richard Vandermeer nodded enthusiastically from his position near the bar. The problem with the military is they're used to everyone following orders without question. They don't understand how the real world works, where respect is earned through achievement, not given because of some government job. Hampton Sr., who had been watching the confrontation with obvious approval, decided to add his voice to the chorus. Derek's handling this exactly right. You can't let these people think they can walk into your home and make demands. Military service doesn't give anyone special privileges in civilized society. Maria felt Elena's hand slip away from hers as her sister took a small step backward, clearly overwhelmed by the hostility radiating from her future family. The woman who had once defended Maria against childhood bullies now seemed frozen by the social and financial pressures that came with her engagement to Derek. "Lena," Maria said quietly, not taking her eyes off Derek's increasingly aggressive posture. "You don't have to be part of this." "Yes, she does," Patricia Hampton interjected sharply. "Lena is going to be a Hampton, which means she needs to understand where her loyalties lie. Family comes first, not some misguided sense of obligation to a sister who clearly doesn't understand her plight." The cruelty of the statement, forcing Elena to choose between her family and her future, wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, apparently recognizing that the situation had moved beyond acceptable social boundaries. Derek, emboldened by his family's support, took another step toward Colonel Blackwood. "I want you both out of my house. Right now. Before I call security and have you thrown out." Colonel Blackwood looked at his phone, where General Morrison was apparently still listening to the entire exchange. "General, did you hear that? Mr. Hampton is threatening to have a decorated combat veteran forcibly removed from his home for the crime of existing while military." "Put that phone away," Derek shouted, reaching for it again. This time his movement was more aggressive, more threatening, and Maria's combat instincts finally kicked into high gear. She moved with the fluid efficiency of someone trained to neutralize threats, stepping between Derek and the colonel while simultaneously creating distance and positioning herself for defensive action if necessary. Her movement was so smooth and professional that it took Derek several seconds to realize he was no longer facing an elderly man, but a trained combat officer. "Miss Hampton," Maria said, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd used to control hostile situations in war zones, "I need you to step back and lower your voice." Derek's response was to let out a harsh laugh. "Are you giving me orders? In my own house, you think because you played dress-up soldier overseas that you can come here and tell a Hampton what to do? I think," Maria replied quietly, "that you're about to make a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." Around them the crowd pressed closer, phones held high to capture what they clearly expected to be Derek Hampton putting the uppity soldier in her place. The energy in the room had shifted from social entertainment to something darker, more primal, the anticipation of violence, of seeing someone brought down. Colonel Blackwood raised his phone slightly, ensuring the microphone would pick up Derek's next words clearly. On the other end of the line, General Morrison was apparently still listening to every word of the confrontation. "Mistake?" Derek repeated, his voice rising to a near shout. "The only mistake here was letting you people think you belonged in the same room as your better. But don't worry, I'm about to correct that mistake right now." What happened next would later be described by witnesses as a perfect storm of arrogance, alcohol, and catastrophically poor judgment. Derek Hampton III, heir to a hotel fortune and product of the finest private schools money could buy, made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, not to call security as he'd threatened, but to begin recording what he clearly intended to be his moment of triumph. The expensive device gleamed in the crystal chandelier light as he held it up, pointing it directly at Maria's face. "Everyone needs to see this," Derek announced to the room, his voice carrying the manic energy of someone who'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. "Everyone needs to see what happens when military people forget their place and try to intimidate their bet." The crowd around them pressed closer, forming a tight circle that effectively trapped Maria and Colonel Blackwood in the center of the living room. What had started as a social gathering had transformed into something resembling a modern-day gladiatorial arena, with the wealthy elite positioning themselves for the best view of what they expected to be a humiliating spectacle. Margaret Whitmore clapped her hands together in delight. "Oh, Derek, what a wonderful idea. We should document this for posterity, show everyone how these military types really behave when they're challenged." Patricia Hampton nodded approvingly, her earlier discomfort completely forgotten in the excitement of seeing her son assert what she considered his rightful dominance. "Make sure you get a good angle, darling. We want people to see her face when she realizes she's been put in her place." Elena stood frozen at the edge of the circle, her champagne glass trembling in her hand as she watched her fiancé and his family orchestrate what could only be described as a public humiliation. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she finally understood the true nature of the people she'd planned to spend her life with. "Derek, please," she whispered, but her voice was lost in the excited chatter of the crowd. Richard Vandermeer had produced his own phone and was recording from a different angle. "This is going to be incredible," he said with obvious glee. The pampered soldier meeting real consequences for the first time in her life. Hampton, energized by the spectacle, stepped forward to address Maria directly. "Young lady, you're about to learn a valuable lesson about respect and social hierarchy. In our world, military rank means nothing. Money, breeding, and social position, those are the things that matter." Maria stood perfectly still in the center of the hostile circle, her military training keeping her alert to every movement, every position, every potential threat. But for the first time all evening, she wasn't thinking about defensive tactics or exit strategy. Instead, she was thinking about the soldiers she'd led, the battles she'd fought, and the values she'd sworn to defend. Colonel Blackwood, still holding his phone with General Morrison on the line, spoke quietly but clearly. "General, I hope you're recording this conversation. I think the Army's leadership should hear exactly how some civilians view our service members." "Recording?" Derek laughed harshly. "Oh, we're definitely recording, but not for your military friends, for every social media, news outlets, anyone who wants to see what happens when soldiers get too big for their britches." He stepped closer to Maria, close enough that his phone was only inches from her face. "Tell everyone watching how it feels to be exposed as a fraud. Tell them how it feels to realize that all your military training and combat experience mean nothing when you're facing people with real power." The circle of spectators pressed even closer, their phones creating a forest of recording devices all pointed at Maria. The excited murmur of voices had grown louder, more aggressive, as the crowd fed off Derek's energy and their own anticipation of witnessing a public downfall. "This is better than anything we could have planned," Margaret Whitmore said to Patricia Hampton, her voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "She actually thought she could come here and intimidate us with her military credentials. How deliciously naive." Patricia smiled with cold satisfaction. Elena needed to see this. She needed to understand the difference between the Rodriguez family's world and ours. This little demonstration should make the social hierarchy perfectly clear. Maria looked around the circle of hostile faces, each one excited to witness her humiliation, each one convinced of their own superiority based on nothing more than inherited wealth and social position. These people had never sacrificed anything for anyone, never put their lives on the line for principles larger than their own comfort, never earned respect through competence and courage, and yet they stood there with their phones and their smug expressions, convinced that they were about to teach her a lesson about her place in the world. "Mr. Hampton," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying despite the crowd's chatter, "I want to make sure I understand the situation correct. You're recording this because you want people to see what happens when a combat veteran with 8 years of service, multiple deployments and commendations for valor stands in the same room as people who inherited their wealth." Derek's grin widened, apparently interpreting her question as a sign of surrender. "Exactly. I want everyone to see what happens when military people think they can intimidate civilians in their own home. I want them to see how quickly that tough soldier act crumbles when faced with real authority. Around them, The crowd murmured approval. Several other phones had appeared, creating a semicircle of recording devices that captured every angle of what they clearly expected to be Maria's moment of defeat. Colonel Blackwood raised his phone slightly, ensuring that General Morrison could hear every word clearly. "General, are you getting all of this? The threat assessment, the hostile crowd, the deliberate intimidation of a decorated officer." "Oh, shut up about your imaginary general," Derek snapped, his patience finally exhausted. "Nobody's coming to save you. Nobody cares about your military connections. This is the real world, and in the real world, money talks and soldiers walk." He thrust his phone even closer to Maria's face, close enough that she could see her own reflection in the camera lens. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my family for disrupting our celebration. You're going to admit that you don't belong here. And then you're going to leave and never come back." The crowd fell silent, waiting for Maria's response. 40 pairs of eyes watched expectantly, phones held ready to capture what they were certain would be her moment of submission and defeat. Colonel Blackwood looked at his phone one more time, then at Maria with an expression that might have been pride. "Captain Rodriguez," he said formally, "I believe it's time." Maria looked around the circle of expectant faces, each one waiting for her moment of defeat with the eager anticipation of spectators at a blood sport. The recording devices formed a technological coliseum around her, ready to capture and broadcast what they believed would be her humiliation to the world. But instead of the broken apology they expected, Maria Rodriguez did something that caught the entire crowd off guard. She smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, or a nervous one, or the forced expression of someone trying to diffuse a tense situation. It was the cold, calculating smile of a professional who had just realized that her opponents had made a series of catastrophic tactical errors. "Miss Hampton," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly uncertain silence, "before I respond to your ultimatum, I'd like to make sure everyone here understands exactly what they're recording." Derek's confidence flickered slightly, though he maintained his aggressive posture. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Maria replied, clasping her hands behind her back in a parade rest position that was immediately recognizable to anyone with military experience, "that you've just spent the last hour publicly documenting your family's deliberate harassment and intimidation of a United States Army officer." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Several people glanced at their phones, suddenly uncertain whether what they were recording was quite the entertainment they'd expected. Margaret Whitmore let out a nervous laugh. "Oh, please. This isn't harassment. This is simply explaining social realities to someone who doesn't understand them." "Social realities?" Maria repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call telling a combat veteran that her service is worthless, that her decorations are meaningless, that she belongs with her own kind rather than in civilized society?" Patricia Hampton's face had gone slightly pale, but she maintained her haughty expression. "We were simply being honest about appropriate social boundaries. There's nothing wrong with that." "Nothing wrong," Maria nodded slowly. "Colonel Blackwood, would you mind putting your phone on speaker? I think everyone here should hear what General Morrison has to say about appropriate social boundaries." Derek's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "There is no General Morrison. You're bluffing." Colonel Blackwood's smile was razor-sharp as he tapped his phone screen. A moment later, a crisp, authoritative voice filled the living room with crystal clarity. "This is General Morrison, Chief of Staff of the United States Army. I've been listening to this entire conversation, and I have to say, I'm deeply disturbed by what I've heard." The effect on the crowd was instantaneous and devastating. Phones trembled in suddenly nerveless hands as the reality of the situation crashed down on them like a collapsing building. They hadn't been recording their triumph over an uppity soldier. They'd been broadcasting their own moral bankruptcy to one of the most powerful military officers in the country. Derek's face went through a series of rapid color changes, from red to white to an unhealthy shade of green. That's not possible. You can't just. This is a private gathering." "Mr. Hampton," General Morrison's voice cut through his stammering like a blade. "Are you under the impression that verbal assault on a decorated Army officer becomes acceptable when conducted in private, or that recording such assault for social media distribution somehow makes it less reprehensible?" Hampton Sr. stepped forward, his business instincts finally overriding his social prejudices. "General, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were simply having a conversation about career choices and social compatibility, nothing more." "A conversation," the general repeated, his tone suggesting exactly what he thought of that characterization. "Miss Hampton, I've just listened to your son compare military decorations to golf trophies, dismiss combat service as playing soldier, and repeatedly refer to a combat veteran as belonging to a lower social class. Would you like me to continue?" The silence that followed was so complete that the ticking of an antique grandfather clock could be heard from the foyer. Even the professional bartenders had stopped moving, apparently mesmerized by the unfolding catastrophe. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Maria, who are you really?" Before Maria could answer, General Morrison's voice filled the room again. "Perhaps I should make the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been spending your evening insulting Captain Maria Rodriguez, who holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 bronze stars and a Purple Heart. She's commanded combat operations that saved hundreds of civilian lives and coalition forces." Margaret Whitmore's hand flew to her throat, her diamonds catching the light as she swayed slightly. "Distinguished Service Cross, but that's the second highest military decoration, second only to the Medal of Honor," General Morrison confirmed. "Captain Rodriguez earned it for extraordinary heroism during a complex enemy attack in Afghanistan, where her tactical decisions and personal courage under fire saved her entire unit and a convoy of civilian contractors." Derek's phone slipped from his nerveless fingers, clattering on the marble floor. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held the room frozen, and suddenly everyone was talking at once, desperate explanations, panicked apologies, and frantic attempts to delete the videos they'd just recorded. "Furthermore," General Morrison continued, his voice cutting through the chaos, "Captain Rodriguez has been selected for promotion to major and assignment to the Pentagon, where she'll be working directly with senior military leadership on strategic operations planning." Patricia Hampton sank into the nearest chair, her face ashen. The woman she'd dismissed as unsuitable for civilized society was not only a decorated war hero, but was about to become part of the military establishment that advised presidents and shaped national security policy. Richard Vandermeer, still clutching his phone, stammered desperately, "General, we didn't know. If we had realized her service record, we never would have." "Never would have what, Mr. Vandermeer?" General Morrison's voice was glacial. "Never would have shown your true character. Never would have revealed your actual opinion of the men and women who defend this country. Never would have demonstrated exactly how little you understand about honor, sacrifice, and service." Colonel Blackwood, who had been watching the crowd's disintegration with evident satisfaction, finally spoke up. "General, I think our hosts are beginning to understand the magnitude of their error." "Indeed, they are, Harrison, and I think Captain Rodriguez deserves to hear a proper apology from each and every person who participated in this disgraceful display." Maria looked around the circle of faces that had been so confident and cruel just moments before. Now they showed nothing but panic, shame, and the desperate calculation of people trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to their reputations and social standing. Derek Hampton III, heir to a hotel fortune and product of the finest schools money could buy, stood in the center of his family's marble-floored living room, with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding that he had just made the biggest mistake of his privileged life. The silence in the Hampton Mansion's living room was deafening. 40 of Westchester County's most prominent citizens stood frozen like deer in headlights, their phones still clutched in their hands, but now feeling more like evidence of their own destruction than instruments of entertainment. General Morrison's voice cut through the stunned quiet with the precision of a surgical blade. "Now I believe Captain Rodriguez deserves to hear those apologies. Starting with you, Mr. Derek Hampton." Derek opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His face had gone from green to a sickly gray, and his hands shook visibly as he stared at Maria as if seeing her for the first time. The woman he'd spent the evening dismissing as beneath his notice was a war hero whose service record made his own accomplishments look like participation trophies. I, Derek stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. Captain Rodriguez, we didn't know. Didn't know what? Maria asked quietly, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd used to command troops under fire. Didn't know that military service requires courage, didn't know that earning rank means demonstrating competence, or didn't know that treating people with respect costs absolutely nothing. Patricia Hampton had recovered enough from her shock to attempt damage control, though her voice still trembled with panic. Captain Rodriguez, please understand, we simply assumed, we thought you were, we never intended any disrespect to someone of your caliber. My caliber, Maria repeated, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. Miss Hampton, what exactly did you think my caliber was when you suggested I get counseling for my war experiences, when you said I belonged with my own kind, when you dismissed my service as playing dress-up? Elena stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, her champagne glass forgotten on a nearby table. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady for the first time all evening. Maria, I am so sorry. I had no idea they would. I never thought they could be. She looked around at Derek's family with an expression of dawning horror. I never really knew them at all, did I? General Morrison's voice returned, carrying the weight of military justice. Miss Rodriguez, your sister has nothing to apologize for. She's been trying to defend you all evening, while these people systematically attempted to humiliate a decorated officer. The question now is what consequences should follow from this documented harassment. The word consequences sent a visible shudder through the crowd. Hampton's, his business instincts finally overriding his social prejudices, stepped forward with the desperate energy of a man watching his empire crumble. General Morrison, surely we can resolve this situation like civilized people. There's been a misunderstanding, clearly, but nothing that can't be worked out through reasonable discussion. A misunderstanding, the general repeated, his tone suggesting he found the characterization about as believable as claims of alien abduction. Miss Hampton, I've just listened to your family spend an hour explaining why military service is worthless, why combat decorations are meaningless, and why a war hero doesn't deserve basic human respect. Which part of that was misunderstood? Margaret Whitmore, apparently deciding that desperate times called for desperate measures, stepped forward with her hands clasped in a gesture of supplication. General, you have to understand our perspective. We simply weren't familiar with military protocols and achievement. If we had known about Captain Rodriguez's distinguished service record, we never would have spoken so carelessly. Carelessly, Maria said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Mrs. Whitmore, you suggested I needed therapy to readjust to normal life. You said I belonged in a VFW hall with my own kind of people. You called me hardened and unseemly. Which part of that was careless rather than deliberately cruel? Colonel Blackwood, who had been listening to the desperate backpedaling with evident satisfaction, finally spoke up. General, I think you should know that these people have recorded this entire incident. Multiple phones, multiple angles, they were planning to post it on social media as entertainment. The revelation sent another wave of panic through the crowd. People began frantically checking their phones, deleting videos, closing social media apps. The evidence of their cruelty that they'd planned to use for entertainment had become potential proof of their harassment of a decorated veteran. Recorded it. General Morrison's voice carried a note of barely controlled fury. They recorded themselves harassing a Purple Heart recipient and planned to broadcast it for amusement. Hampton, are you aware that cyberbullying a military service member can fall under federal hate crime statutes? Hampton Sr.'s face went white. Federal General, surely you're not suggesting that this rises to the level of criminal charges. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Hampton. I'm stating facts. Captain Rodriguez is a member of a protected class under military service member harassment laws. The deliberate recorded intimidation and humiliation of a veteran based on their military status is a serious federal offense. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out as a desperate whisper. We'll delete everything. Every recording, every video. We'll make sure nothing gets posted anywhere. Please. You have to understand, this was never meant to go this far. Meant to go how far? Maria asked, stepping closer to the man who had spent the evening explaining why she didn't belong in civilized society. How far was it meant to go, Derek? Were you planning to stop at calling my service worthless, at comparing my decorations to golf trophy, at suggesting I was too damaged for polite company? Elena moved to stand beside her sister, her engagement ring catching the chandelier light as her hand shook. Derek, I need you to listen to me very carefully. My sister is a war hero. She's saved lives, led soldiers through combat, earned decorations for valor that most people can't even pronounce. And you spent the evening trying to humiliate her for your own entertainment. Elena, please, Derek begged, reaching for her hand. You have to understand, we didn't know who she really was. If you had known, you would have treated her with respect. Elena's voice carried a bitter laugh. Derek, the problem isn't that you didn't know about her service record. The problem is that you think basic human decency should depend on someone's achievements. The problem is that you and your family are exactly the kind of people my sister has spent 8 years protecting, and you repaid her service with cruelty. General Morrison's voice returned one final time, carrying the authority of the United States Army. Captain Rodriguez, the decision on how to proceed is yours. You've conducted yourself with exceptional professionalism under circumstances that would justify a much stronger response. Whatever you decide, you have the full support of the military establishment. Maria looked around the circle of terrified faces, each one now understanding the magnitude of their error. These people who had spent the evening explaining why she didn't belong in their world were now begging for mercy from the woman they'd tried to destroy. For a moment, it seemed as though the evening might end with apologies and damage control. The Hampton family and their guests appeared to understand the gravity of their situation, their earlier arrogance replaced by genuine fear of the consequences they now faced. Even Derek had stopped his desperate stammering and stood quietly, apparently recognizing that silence might be his best strategy. But Derek Hampton III had never been good at knowing when to stop. Perhaps it was the wine, or the humiliation of being dressed down in front of his family's social circle, or simply the ingrained arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his action. Whatever the reason, as Maria turned to speak quietly with Elena, Derek's wounded pride finally overrode what little survival instinct he possessed. You know what? He said, his voice cutting through the tense quiet like breaking glass. I don't care who you are or what medals you have. You're still just Elena's trashy sister from Queens who doesn't belong here. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Several guests gasped audibly. Hampton closed his eyes in defeat, and Patricia Hampton actually took a step backward as if trying to distance herself from her son's suicide by stupidity. But Derek wasn't finished. The alcohol and humiliation had unlocked something ugly and desperate in him, and 8 years of suppressed resentment came pouring out like poison from a lanced wound. You want to know the truth? He continued, his voice rising with manic energy. Elena's embarrassed by you. She's been embarrassed by you for years. Why do you think she never talks about her family? Why do you think she moved across the country the first chance she got? Elena's face went white. Derek, stop, please. No. Derek screamed, spittle flying from his lips. I'm tired of pretending. She told me all about growing up poor, about having a sister who ran off to play army instead of getting a real education. She said you were the family disappointment, the one who couldn't make it in the real world, so you had to hide in the military. The lies were so vicious, so deliberately crafted to inflict maximum damage, that even Margaret Whitmore looked horrified. Elena made a sound like a wounded animal, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at her fiancé in absolute shock. That's not true, Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. I never said any of those things. Derek, how could you lie like that? But Derek was beyond reason now, his face twisted with rage and desperation. She said you were damaged goods. She said you'd probably come back from your little wars all messed up in the head, unable to function in normal society. She said she was relieved when you re-enlisted because it meant she wouldn't have to deal with your problem. Colonel Blackwood's hand moved to Maria's shoulder, a steadying presence as Derek's venomous words filled the room. The retired officer had seen the aftermath of psychological warfare before, and he recognized the deliberate cruelty of Derek's attack. Elena begged me not to invite you tonight, Derek continued, his voice reaching a fevered pitch. She said you'd embarrass yourself and make everyone uncomfortable. She said you'd probably show up in your uniform because you don't own real clothes, and everyone would know exactly what kind of family she came from. Derek, stop, Elena screamed, her voice breaking with anguish. None of that is true. You're lying. You're making it all up. But Derek was beyond stopping. In his desperation to wound Maria, he had chosen to destroy the one thing that might have saved him. Elena's love and loyalty. She said the only reason she keeps in touch with you is guilt. He spat, his eyes fixed on Maria's face as he searched for signs that his psychological assault was working. Guilt, because she escaped and you did. Guilt, because she is a real life and you're stuck playing soldier with a bunch of other losers who couldn't make it in civilian society. The room had gone completely silent, except for Elena's sobbing. Even the professional bartenders had stopped moving, apparently transfixed by the spectacular self-destruction unfolding before them. General Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Miss Hampton, are you aware that you're currently committing criminal defamation against a federal officer while being recorded? Derek's response was to let out a harsh laugh. Criminal defamation? For telling the truth about what his own sister thinks of him. Elena, tell them what you really think about your soldier sister. Elena looked at Derek with an expression of such profound disgust that several people in the crowd actually stepped away from him. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite her tears. Derek, Hampton, you are the most vile, despicable human being I have ever met. My sister is a war hero who has spent 8 years serving our country with honor and distinction. She's saved lives, led soldiers through combat, and earned decorations that you couldn't even pronounce correct. She pulled the engagement ring from her finger with trembling hands. I have never been embarrassed by Maria. I have never said a single negative word about her service. The only thing I'm embarrassed by is the fact that I almost married someone who could stand in a room full of people and lie with such casual cruelty. Derek stared at the ring in Elena's palm as if it were a live grenade. Elena, you can't be serious. You're going to throw away everything we have because of some lies your psycho sister probably made you believe. It was Colonel Blackwood who answered, his voice carrying the cold fury of a professional warrior who had just watched someone attack the foundations of military service itself. Miss Hampton, you just called a Distinguished Service Cross recipient a psycho. You have now moved from harassment into criminal territory. Maria stood perfectly still in the center of the hostile room, her face showing no emotion as Derek's lies washed over her like rain. She had endured enemy propaganda, hostile interrogations, and psychological warfare from trained professionals. The desperate attacks of a spoiled rich boy were barely worth acknowledging. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone in the room stop breathing. Derek Hampton, you have just made the final mistake of your privileged life. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Maria's voice had carried the same quiet finality that she'd once used to call in artillery strikes on enemy positions. Calm, precise, and absolutely irreversible. Derek seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed, but his wine-addled brain couldn't quite process the magnitude of his error. What's that supposed to mean? He demanded, trying to reclaim some semblance of his earlier bravado. You're going to what? Attack me? Prove my point about military people being violent and unstable? Maria looked at him with the expression of someone studying an insect under a microscope. Curious, detached, and utterly without sympathy. Miss Hampton, I've spent 8 years protecting people like you from threats you can't even imagine. I've led soldiers through hostile territory to secure supply lines that keep your comfortable world functioning. I've called in airstrikes to protect villages full of people who had nothing to offer me except their gratitude. She took a single step forward, and Derek instinctively stepped back, his survival instincts finally recognizing predator behavior even if his conscious mind couldn't process it. But you know what the most dangerous part of my job was, Maria continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. It wasn't the insurgents or the IEDs or the hostile fire. It was making sure that people who don't deserve protection still receive it anyway. Because that's what honor means. General Morrison's voice cut through Derek's attempt to respond. Captain Rodriguez, I believe it's time to inform Mr. Hampton about the consequences of his choice. Maria nodded slightly, her eyes never leaving Derek's face. Derek Hampton, you have spent this evening committing multiple federal crimes while being recorded by numerous devices. You have harassed a decorated military officer based on her service status, which violates federal hate crime statutes. You have engaged in criminal defamation of a federal officer, and most recently, you have committed criminal harassment by calling a Purple Heart recipient a psycho. Hampton stepped forward desperately. Captain Rodriguez, surely we can work something out. My son has clearly had too much to drink. He's not thinking clearly. Perhaps if we made a significant donation to a veterans charity. Miss Hampton, General Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone who had never been successfully bribed or intimidated. Are you attempting to offer financial compensation to make federal crimes disappear? Because that would constitute attempted bribery of a military officer, which carries its own set of penalties. The blood drained from Hampton Singer's face, as he realized he had just made the situation exponentially worse. Around the room, other guests began edging toward the exits, apparently recognizing that they were witnessing something that could destroy careers and reputations. Elena stepped closer to her sister, the engagement ring still clutched in her trembling hand. Maria, I'm so sorry I brought you here. I exposed you to this. I almost married someone who could say such horrible things. Elena, Maria said gently, turning to face her sister for the first time since Derek's final attack. You have nothing to apologize for. You defended me, supported me, and showed more courage tonight than most people manage in a lifetime. I'm proud to be your sister. The simple words, spoken with genuine warmth, seemed to break something inside Elena. She threw her arms around Maria, sobbing with relief and grief, and the overwhelming weight of finally understanding what real character looked like. Colonel Blackwood cleared his throat. General Morrison, I believe Captain Rodriguez should know about her options moving forward. Indeed, the general replied. Captain Rodriguez, you have several courses of action available. You can file formal complaints through military channels, pursue federal charges through the Justice Department, or handle this matter through social consequences. The choice is entirely yours. Derek's face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray, as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his alcohol-fogged brain. Federal charges? You can't be serious. This was just a social disagreement. People say things at parties they don't mean. Miss Hampton, Maria said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. You didn't just say things you didn't mean. You orchestrated a deliberate campaign of harassment, recorded it for social media distribution, and then escalated to criminal defamation when your initial attacks failed to break me. She gestured around the room at the dozens of phones that had captured Derek's evening of cruelty. You have provided overwhelming evidence of your crimes distributed across multiple devices, witnessed by dozens of people, and confirmed by the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Margaret Whitmore, who had been silent since Derek's final meltdown, stepped forward with the desperate energy of someone watching her social world collapse. Captain Rodriguez, surely you understand that Derek is facing consequences far beyond what the situation warrants. His career, his reputation, his entire future could be destroyed. Maria turned to look at Margaret with an expression of mild curiosity. Mrs. Whitmore, are you suggesting that the consequences for harassing a war veteran should be less severe than the harassment itself? I'm suggesting that perhaps the punishment should fit the crime, Margaret replied, though her voice lacked conviction. The punishment should fit the crime, Maria repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Whitmore, what do you think would be fitting consequences for spending an evening explaining to a Purple Heart recipient that her service is worthless, her decorations are meaningless, and she belongs with her own kind? Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again, apparently unable to formulate an answer that wouldn't make her situation worse. General Morrison's voice returned. carrying the weight of military justice. Captain Rodriguez, I should inform you that this incident has already been forwarded to the appropriate authorities. The recordings from this evening will be reviewed by federal prosecutors to determine what charges should be filed. Derek's knees seemed to give out, and he sank onto the nearest chair like a man who had just received a terminal diagnosis. This can't be happening, he whispered. This was supposed to be. Elena was supposed to choose her family over some soldier sister she barely knew. Elena looked at the man she had almost married with an expression of complete revulsion. Derek, I've seen more integrity in the last 5 minutes than you've shown in 2 years of engagement. Maria is 10 times the person you could ever hope to be. Derek looked up at her with tears streaming down his face. Elena, please. You know me. You know I'm not really like this. It was just the wine, just the pressure, just your true character, Maria finished quietly. Mr. Hampton, alcohol doesn't create cruelty, it reveals it. Tonight, you showed everyone in this room exactly who you really are. She looked around the circle of terrified faces one final time, her expression calm and professional. And now you're all going to live with the consequences of that revelation.
What happened next unfolded with the speed and efficiency of a military operation. Within minutes of General Morrison ending his call, the Hampton mansion became the center of a carefully coordinated response that demonstrated exactly how seriously the federal government took attacks on decorated veterans. The first sign that Derek's world was collapsing came in the form of his own phone buzzing incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, and social media notifications flooded his device as word of the evening's events began spreading through digital channels faster than wildfire through dry grass. Derek, Hampton Sr. said urgently, staring at his own phone with growing horror. The hotel board is calling an emergency meeting. Someone posted video clips online. The phones at corporate headquarters are already ringing. Patricia Hampton had gone completely white, her hands shaking as she scrolled through her social media feeds. The yacht club, the charity boards. Derek, they're all seeing this. Margaret, look at this. Someone posted the part where you called her damaged goods. Margaret Whitmore's face crumpled as she realized that her social standing, built over decades of careful networking and strategic donations, was evaporating in real time. This is a disaster, she whispered. The Historical Society just removed me from their board. The Children's Hospital is asking for my resignation. But the social media storm was just the beginning. Colonel Blackwood, still maintaining his connection with General Morrison, received a text that made him smile grimly. Captain Rodriguez, I think you should know that the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office has just issued a statement about tonight's incident. He read from his phone with obvious satisfaction. Quote, the United States Army is aware of a documented incident involving the harassment of Captain Maria Rodriguez, a decorated combat veteran with multiple service commendations including the Distinguished Service Cross. The Army stands firmly behind Captain Rodriguez and will pursue all available legal remedies against those involved in this unacceptable attack on a service member. End quote. Derek's face went from gray to green as the implications hit him. The Pentagon issued a statement? About me? About tonight? Elena, still standing protectively beside her sister, looked at Derek with a mixture of pity and disgust. Derek, you harassed a war hero while being recorded by dozens of people. What did you think was going to happen? The answer came in the form of Hampton Sr.'s phone ringing with a call that made his face drain of all color. It's our legal team, he said in a voice barely above a whisper. They're saying federal investigators want to schedule interviews. They're talking about hate crime charges, criminal harassment, cyberbullying statutes. Around the room, other guests were discovering their own consequences. Richard Vandermeer stared at his phone in shock. My law firm just put me on administrative leave pending an investigation. They said a video of me mocking military service is trending on social media. The speed of the digital reckoning was breathtaking. Within an hour of Derek's final attack on Maria, clips from the evening's recordings had been shared thousands of times across multiple platforms. The hashtag Hampton Disgrace was trending nationally, and news outlets were already picking up the story. Colonel Blackwood's phone buzzed with another update. Captain Rodriguez, CNN wants a statement. So do Fox News, MSNBC, and The Washington Post. This story is going national. Maria remained calm in the center of the collapsing social order, her military training having prepared her for the aftermath of decisive action. Colonel, Please tell the media that I have no comment at this time, but that I'm grateful for the Army's support and the Constitution's protection of service members. Derek made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. Maria, please, I'll do anything. I'll make a public apology. I'll donate to military charities. Please, you have to understand, I'm facing criminal charges. My family's business could be destroyed. Maria looked at him with the same expression she might use to regard an enemy combatant who had just surrendered. Mr. Hampton, you spent this evening explaining why consequences don't apply to people like you. Now you're going to discover exactly how wrong you were. Elena stepped forward, her voice steady despite her tears. Derek, you had the chance to apologize hours ago. You had the chance to show basic human decency. Instead, you chose cruelty, harassment, and lies. These aren't consequences that are happening to you, these are consequences you earned. General Morrison's voice returned one final time, carrying the weight of institutional authority. Captain Rodriguez, I want you to know that this incident will be used as a case study in military academies about the proper response to civilian harassment of service members. Your conduct tonight has been exemplary. Hampton Sr. made one last desperate attempt at damage control. General Morrison, surely there's some way to resolve this situation that doesn't destroy everyone involved. My son made a mistake, but does it have to ruin his entire life? Hampton, the general replied with ice-cold precision. Your son didn't make a mistake. He orchestrated a deliberate campaign of harassment against a war hero, recorded it for entertainment, and escalated to criminal behavior when his initial attacks failed. The only mistake he made was underestimating the consequences of attacking someone who has spent 8 years defending people who don't deserve it. As if summoned by the general's words, the doorbell rang with the kind of official, authoritative chime that made everyone in the room freeze. Through the mansion's tall windows, the unmistakable red and blue lights of police vehicles could be seen reflecting off the perfectly manicured grounds. Federal Bureau of Investigation, came a voice from outside. We have a warrant to collect evidence related to the harassment of a military service member. Derek Hampton III, who had started the evening confident in his social superiority and convinced of his immunity from consequences, now sat collapsed in a chair worth more than most people's cars, watching federal agents walk up the driveway of his family's mansion to arrest him for the crime of underestimating the wrong veteran. Patricia Hampton began to cry, not the delicate tears of social embarrassment, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone watching their world end. How did this happen so fast? She whispered. Maria answered with the calm professionalism that had carried her through 8 years of military service. Mrs. Hampton, this is what accountability looks like when it finally catches up with people who thought they were above it. In the weeks that followed what the media dubbed the Hampton incident, the ripple effects spread far beyond the marble halls of one Westchester mansion. The story became a national conversation about respect for veterans, the dangers of social media vigilantism, and the reality that true privilege comes from character, not bank accounts. The video footage from that evening, compiled from dozens of phones, became the most watched veteran advocacy content in social media history. Military organizations used Derek Hampton's public meltdown as a teaching tool about civilian-military relations, while business schools added it to their ethics curricula as a case study in catastrophic leadership failure. Captain Maria Rodriguez found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as a symbol of veteran dignity and professional grace under fire. The Pentagon's Public Affairs Office was flooded with interview requests, but Maria maintained her policy of letting her service record speak for itself. When she did agree to speak publicly, it was at veteran advocacy events and military academies, where she emphasized service over personal recognition. The real heroes, she told a packed auditorium at West Point, are the soldiers who never came home, the ones who sacrificed everything so that people like the Hamptons could live in safety and comfort. My job was to honor their sacrifice by maintaining military standards even when civilians forgot what those standards meant. The Hampton family's destruction was as swift as it was comprehensive. Derek Hampton III faced federal charges under multiple statutes: harassment of a military service member, criminal defamation, and cyberbullying with intent to cause emotional distress. His legal team's attempts to plea bargain were complicated by the overwhelming video evidence and the federal government's determination to make an example of anyone who attacked decorated veterans. Hampton hotels faced an immediate consumer boycott that cost them 30% of their bookings within the first month. Corporate sponsors pulled out of Hampton family charitable events, and the family's social standing in Westchester evaporated overnight. Hampton Sr. was forced to step down from multiple corporate boards as companies distanced themselves from the scandal. Patricia Hampton, once the queen of county charity events, found herself persona non grata in the social circles she'd dominated for decades. The organizations that had once competed for her attention now refused to return her phone calls. Her resignation from the hospital board came with a statement that her personal values were incompatible with the organization's commitment to serving all members of the community. Margaret Whitmore's fall was perhaps the most spectacular. The woman who had positioned herself as the arbiter of social acceptability discovered that her own acceptability had evaporated completely. The yacht club revoked her membership, the Historical Society removed her name from their donor wall, and the exclusive private clubs that had once sought her approval now barred her from their premises. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the cultural shift that the incident sparked. Veterans organizations across the country reported a surge in public support and volunteer applications. The Respect Our Veterans movement gained millions of supporters, and businesses began implementing veteran sensitivity training for their employees. Colonel Harrison Blackwood became an unlikely social media celebrity when his calm professionalism during the incident went viral. The retired officer used his newfound platform to advocate for veteran issues and to remind civilians that military service represented the highest ideals of American society. What people saw that night, he told a congressional hearing on veteran affairs, was the difference between inherited privilege and earned honor. Captain Rodriguez demonstrated the values that our military instills: grace under pressure, protection of others, and dignity in the face of adversity. The Hampton family demonstrated what happens when wealth replaces wisdom. Elena Rodriguez Hampton, she legally changed her name back within a week of the incident, became a powerful advocate for military families. Her decision to choose her sister over social status resonated with millions of Americans who faced their own choices between family loyalty and social pressure. "I almost married into that family," she told a gathering of military spouses. "I almost became someone who would have looked down on the very people who protect our freedom. Maria saved me from becoming a person I wouldn't have been able to live with." The engagement ring that Elena had thrown at Derek's feet was eventually auctioned for charity, raising $50,000 for wounded veteran services. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The token of Derek's love had become a contribution to the very people he'd attacked. Derek himself became a cautionary tale studied in business schools and psychology courses. His complete psychological breakdown under pressure, captured in real time by multiple cameras, provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the collapse of narcissistic personality structures when confronted with genuine consequences. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's handling of the case became a model for prosecuting harassment of service members. The speed and thoroughness of their response sent a clear message to anyone who might consider attacking veterans. The full weight of federal law enforcement would be brought to bear on such cases. General Morrison used the incident to push through new protections for military personnel, including enhanced penalties for harassment and streamlined reporting procedures. Captain Rodriguez's experience showed us that our service members need better protection from the very people they swore to defend, he testified before Congress. 6 months after that fateful evening, the Hampton mansion went up for sale. The family's financial situation, combined with the toxic associations of the property, made it impossible to maintain their lifestyle. The house that had once symbolized generational wealth and social dominance became a reminder that no amount of money could buy respect if it wasn't earned through character. The new owners, a veteran-owned charity foundation, converted the mansion into a retreat center for wounded warriors. The marble floors that had once echoed with Derek's cruel laughter now rang with the voices of heroes recovering from their service to the nation. Maria Rodriguez, meanwhile, quietly continued her military career, her promotion to major proceeding on schedule despite the national attention. She remained focused on her duties, her soldiers, and the principles that had guided her through 8 years of service and one unforgettable evening in Westchester County. 2 years after the Hampton incident, Major Maria Rodriguez stood in the same Target parking lot where she'd once bought a simple picture frame for her sister's engagement party. This time, she was in her dress uniform, having just finished speaking at a veterans memorial service. The bronze star on her chest caught the late afternoon sunlight, a new addition to her already impressive collection of ribbons. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Saw your speech on the news. Dad would be so proud. Coffee tomorrow before you head back to DC." Maria smiled as she typed back. "Wouldn't miss it. Your treat this time, Mrs. Chen." Elena had married David Chen, a pediatric surgeon she'd met while volunteering at the Veterans Retreat Center that had once been the Hampton Mansion. Their wedding had been a small, beautiful ceremony held at Fort Braxton, where Elena had insisted on exchanging vows under the American flag that her sister served. As Maria drove through the familiar streets of her childhood neighborhood in Queens, she reflected on how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. The modest two-bedroom house where she and Elena had grown up still stood on the same corner, now owned by another working-class family with big dreams and bigger hearts. She pulled into the driveway of Elena's new home, a comfortable suburban house that Elena and David had bought specifically because it was 10 minutes from the VA hospital where David volunteered his surgical skills. Elena emerged from the front door, her face glowing with the particular radiance of someone 6 months pregnant with her first child. "Maria," Elena called out, hurrying over as fast as her condition allowed. "I can't believe you're already showing. And look at you, another medal." "Bronze Star with V device," Maria said, accepting her sister's careful hug. "For that operation in Syria last year. But enough about me, how are you feeling? How's my future niece or nephew?" They settled onto Elena's back porch with coffee and homemade cookies, the kind of simple comfort that money couldn't buy but love provided freely. In the distance they could see the spires of the city where they'd grown up, where their father had worked with his hands and their mother had shaped young minds. "I got a letter yesterday," Elena said quietly, pulling an envelope from her pocket. "From Derek." Maria's expression didn't change, but Elena noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Derek Hampton III had been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for his crimes, along with 5 years of probation and mandatory community service at veteran organizations. The Hampton family fortune had been decimated by legal fees, civil settlements, and the collapse of their business empire. "He's getting out in 6 months," Elena continued. "The letter, it was different, not asking for forgiveness or trying to justify what he did, just acknowledging it. He said he's been working with a therapist and volunteering at a veterans center inside the prison. He wanted me to know that he finally understands what he destroyed that night, not just his own life but his chance to be a decent human being." Maria sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "What do you think about that?" "I think," Elena said slowly, "that real accountability means accepting consequences without expecting forgiveness. Maybe Derek is finally learning that lesson, but you know what the strangest part is?" "What?" "I'm grateful it happened." Maria raised an eyebrow. "Grateful?" Elena's hand moved to her growing belly. "If Derek hadn't shown his true character that night, I would have married him. I would have become someone who looked down on service members, who valued money over honor, who taught my children that privilege excused cruelty." She looked at her sister with tears in her eyes. "You saved me from becoming a person I couldn't have lived with." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the neighborhood where 2 little girls had once dreamed of changing the world, one through service, one through love. "You know what Colonel Blackwood told me last week?" Maria said finally. "What?" "He said that night taught him something he'd never fully understood in 40 years of military service. He said he'd always known that we serve to protect people's freedom, but he'd never realized that sometimes we serve to protect people from themselves, from their worst impulses, their cruelest instincts, their capacity for moral failure." Elena nodded slowly. The Hampton family had everything: wealth, status, education, opportunity, but they had never learned the most basic human values: respect, dignity, humility, gratitude. And, Maria added with a slight smile, they had never encountered someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or impressed by their money. As the evening stars began to appear, Maria's phone buzzed with a message from her commanding officer. Her next assignment was confirmed. She would be leading a joint task force on veteran affairs, working directly with Congress to improve support for transitioning service members. "More responsibility," Elena observed, reading over her sister's shoulder. "More opportunity to serve," Maria corrected. "That's all I've ever wanted. The chance to make a difference, to protect people, to honor the sacrifice of those who came before me." Elena stood up carefully, her hand resting on her belly. "What are you going to tell your child about their Aunt Maria?" "I'm going to tell them," Elena said softly, "that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite being afraid. I'm going to tell them that true strength comes from serving others, not ruling over them, and I'm going to tell them that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons but with character." As Maria prepared to leave, Elena handed her a small wrapped package, "For your new office in the Pentagon." Maria unwrapped it carefully, revealing a framed photo from Elena's wedding day. In the picture, Maria stood in her dress uniform next to Elena in a simple white dress, both sisters smiling under the American flag. At the bottom, Elena had written, "To my hero, thank you for showing me that real nobility comes from service, not status." Driving back toward her hotel, Maria passed the interstate exit that led to the Hampton estate. The property that had once symbolized untouchable privilege was now the Rodriguez-Chen Veterans Retreat Center, where wounded warriors came to heal, surrounded by the beauty that had once been reserved for the wealthy elite. She thought about Derek Hampton, sitting in a federal prison cell, perhaps finally learning the lessons that his privileged upbringing had never taught him. She thought about the soldiers she'd led through combat, the lives that had been saved, the freedoms that had been preserved. Most of all, she thought about the little girl from Queens who had dreamed of serving her country, never imagining that her greatest victory would come not on a battlefield, but in a marble-floored mansion where she proved that true power comes not from wealth or status, but from the unshakable foundation of character, integrity, and service to others. The American flag on her uniform caught the streetlight as she drove toward her next assignment, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles are won not by those who have the most, but by those who give the most. And in the end, that made all the difference. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.